Good morning. It is 9 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. Hope you all are having a good morning. Thanks for everybody who's here. We're going to be looking at Revelation chapter 17 this morning. So we've been making our way through the book of Revelation, and chapter 17 I think is a pretty interesting one. I think it's kind of neat. You get to talk a little bit about some Roman history and some of the emperors as you go. So we're going to do that this morning. So I've got a PowerPoint whenever you guys get a chance to bring that up, and just leave it on that first slide until the one that just says Revelation 17 is good. So in this chapter, you're going to see John. He's carried away. He's going to have a vision of a harlot sitting on a beast. It will be the beast that we saw in chapter 13. Does anybody remember in chapter 13? We know that the nation that's persecuting the church this time is who? Rome. When we looked at chapter 13, we talked about some of the emperors, right? Do you remember the one that we talked about? It seems like the 666 was representing. Nero. Well, it's kind of a trick question. So Nero seems to be the one that 666 represents. There are some early Greek manuscripts that say 616, and if you take off the last N off Neron Caesar and make it Nero Caesar, Nero Caesar, it ends up with 616. Some of the early writers said that they reference it referring to Nero, and some people thought it was Latinos, which means the Latin man, which of course that would be the Roman emperor as well. And so we talked about in chapter 13, flip back at chapter 13, and let's look at one verse that we'll sort of, I guess, talk a little bit more about when we're here in chapter 17. So go to Revelation chapter 13, and look at verse 3. Revelation 13:3 says this: I saw one of his heads. It's talking about the beast that rose up out of the sea with 7 heads and 10 horns. And it says, verse 3, I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast. Remember what we talked about when we looked at that? We talked about Nero. Do you remember there was a myth we talked about? In the notes, there's lots of references. It was called the Nero Redivivius myth, which basically means Nero resurrected. And there was this myth that was really popular in the first century that whenever Nero died, he actually didn't commit he did commit suicide. I mean, he did that with the Praetorian Guard surrounding him in a house outside of Rome. But some people thought, well, maybe he didn't really kill himself and that he had fled to Parthia, fled east, and he was gathering an army to come back and take over Rome. And so when you have this verse here, I think, and lots of other guys, it doesn't mean it's right, but that this is what this is referencing. A mortal wound that was healed. Now in 17, I think that's going to come into play a little bit more, where you have what I think is even more specific reference to exactly which emperor is going to be discussed as being the beast, okay? So in chapter 13, the beast is the Roman emperor. It's described as Nero, but I think you're going to see in chapter 17, at this time, Nero is already dead. And so the person that is going to be the actual beast is the person who's just like Nero, okay? Which is going to be Domitian. So Linda, you weren't wrong. So it's kind of like there's really 2 right answers to that. So if you're a first century Christian and you see Revelation 13 referencing Nero, well, you know that Nero is already what? He's already dead. So you know, okay, this is going to be a leader that's going to be like Nero, okay? So let's go to Revelation chapter 17. Babylon's fall, Babylon has fallen, has already been declared. It's as if it's already happened, but you're still getting details to it, okay? And so in chapter 17 and then maybe 18, I don't know how far we'll get today, I think that it's going to be proven that Rome is the person that's persecuting Christians without a doubt. I think chapter 13, where it talks about the beast and it references Daniel 7, where you had a prediction of Rome and it seems to be fulfilled, I think chapter 17 and 18 give you even more specific information that does not fit with anybody at that time except Rome, okay? So in 17 and 18, you're going to see that the harlot is sitting on 7 hills. Rome was called the city of 7 hills, okay? It says at the end of chapter 17, the great city that rules the entire earth. All right, well, who is ruling the whole world in the first century? Rome is. Jerusalem's not, okay? Number 3, they persecuted the saints. And number 4, when we get to chapter 18, you'll see that whoever this is, they lead the earth commercially. They're the one that all the merchants of the world look to. And so that also seems to fit with with Rome, okay? So let's look at Revelation chapter 17 and verse 1. Then one of the angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me and said, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot that sits on many waters." All right, now let's just, for the sake of making this easier on ourselves, skip down in chapter 17 to verse 18. Somebody read Revelation 17:18. Okay, so sometimes in Revelation, later in the book, it just gives you pretty simply, hey, flat out, this is who that is. So in this harlot, this woman that is pictured here in verse 1, verse 18 says, "The woman whom you saw is that great city," which great city? "Which reigns over the kings of the earth." Who do we think that is? Rome, okay? So it's Rome, okay? So you have here, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters," the city of Rome, okay? So it's going to be this image, right? So if we can go back to, I know you got a hard job flipping back and forth between verses and PowerPoints, but if you go back to that PowerPoint, the second slide is just sort of like an image. It's sort of hard to depict it exactly, but whenever you get there, go ahead and advance it to the next slide, Larry, whenever you get back that city, the image with the beast. Or I can advance it. All right, maybe it'll take a second to just kind of power up. So you have this vision of a great harlot who is sitting on many waters. It's the nation of Rome. She's the woman, and she's going to be sitting on the back of a beast, okay? Look at verse 15 of Revelation 17. What does it mean where it says, "who sits on many waters"? I've heard some people explain this and say, well, Rome sat on the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, which is true. But verse 15 of Revelation 17 says this, Revelation 17:15. "He said to me, the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits," okay, so these waters, what are they? They're peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. How many things is that? 4, right? So when you put this 17:1, who is the woman? What does it mean she's sitting on the waters? Well, the end of the chapter clears that up. It says this is the great city that rules over the whole world, and she is in charge of all of these things in verse 15, peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. All right, so this is supposed to be one vision of this woman who is the city of Rome, okay? And she's riding on this 7-headed beast, which we saw in chapter 13, which is going to be the emperor, okay? And as we move forward, you'll see that a little bit more as well, okay? Look at Revelation chapter 17 and verse 2. As always, in the notes, I have all kinds of Old Testament language. You know, the judgment of the great harlot that sits on many waters. In the Old Testament, any nation that was spiritually evil, the Bible used this sort of language. Nineveh is described in Nahum chapter 3 and verse 4. It says this, "Because of the multitude of her harlotries, of the seductive harlot," talking about Nineveh, "the mistress of sorceries who sells nations through her harlotry and families through her sorceries," right? Tyre is described this way. Jerusalem is described this way in Isaiah. I've got all those references if you want to look them up on your own. So once again, it's using what kind of language? Yeah, apocalyptic Old Testament language, and it's just using it in the New Testament to describe this persecution Rome is bringing against the Christians. All right, so look at verse 2. This is the great harlot into verse 1. Verse 2, "With whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication." All right? When it talks about fornication and the wine of her fornication, it's just talking about basically they were immoral because of her, right? Lots of times in the Old Testament, you have this description of physical, like sexual immorality or fornication, used to describe spiritual unfaithfulness, right? And that's all they're doing. That's all they're doing here. In the notes, I have lots of other Old Testament references, specifically from Jeremiah. This section alludes to Jeremiah a lot. Okay, so look at verse 3. "So he carried me away in the Spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. So you have this woman who's sitting on a beast, okay? And the beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. Where have we already seen that in the book? 12:13, yeah. I mean, you don't have to remember the exact chapter, but we've already seen this beast. And this beast is the emperor, okay? 13 gives you a number to identify it called the number of a man, which seems to point to Nero, which if you're in the first century, Nero's dead, so you know it's pointing to an emperor like it. And in chapter 17, you're going to get even more specific, I think, information as to who exactly this is, okay? So it has 7 heads and 10 horns. blasphemous names, just like chapter 13, verse 1. 13:1 uses the exact same language that you see here. Okay, all right, look at verse 4. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. All right, what's that? What does that represent to you? Royalty, wealth, just power. It's just she's not roughing it, okay? So she's got arrayed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. So she's dressed like somebody wealthy, a wealthy nation, and she has a golden cup in her hand. I'll give you Jeremiah 51. Let me read you 2 verses. Jeremiah 51 and verse 7 says this. Babylon was a golden cup in the Lord's hand that made all the earth drunk. The nations drank her wine. Therefore the nations are deranged. Jeremiah 51:57. I will make drunk her princes and wise men, her governors and deputies, her mighty men. They shall sleep a perpetual sleep and not awake, says the King, whose name is the Lord of hosts. Once again, Old Testament language describing this is something that was written about Babylon. And here in the New Testament, you have the exact language used about Rome, because Rome is Babylon in the book of Revelation. Okay? Look at verse 5. This is an interesting verse. And on her forehead, this is the harlot, was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. So the woman, the great harlot, we see at the end of the chapter is Rome. It's interesting, a lot of commentators talk about in the first century, prostitutes would actually wear a headband with their names on it. That was like a sign that, hey, this is a prostitute, right? They didn't try to keep it hidden. And so it seems like John is picking up on some of this language and saying, hey, she wears this nameplate on the front of her head that has her name, which means, wow, you look at her and you tell she's a harlot, okay? You tell she's a prostitute. Look at verse 6. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, and when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement, okay? So Rome persecuted Christians. In the notes, I have about 3 paragraphs from Tacitus, who was a Roman historian, talking about some of the things Rome did to Christians. If you want to read that, he talks about Nero. He says this. Let me read a little bit of this. He says, let's see. Nero had somehow ordered the fire, infamous rumors. So there was this rumor that when Rome burnt, that Nero was the one who caused it. And they say that Nero fiddled while Rome burned, which actually look at the history, that it's not, has no, like he was actually out of the city. When he heard about it, he actually rushed back to help. So he didn't fiddle while Rome burned. And then it says, the originator of the name, Christ, was executed as a criminal by the procurator Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Okay? So this is someone that's not a Christian, Tacitus, and he's writing about, first of all, he identifies that Christ was in fact killed by the Roman government. Okay? And then if you skip down through there, therefore first those were seized who admitted their faith, and then using that information provided, a vast multitude were convicted, not so much for the crime of burning the city, but they said that they hated the human race. And then Tacitus writes about what happened to Christians. Perishing, they were additionally made into sports. They were killed by dogs, by having the hides of beasts attached to them, or they were nailed to crosses or set aflame. And when the daylight had passed, they were used as nighttime lamps. Nero gave his own gardens for this spectacle and performed a circus game in the habit of a charioteer mixing with the plebes or driving about the racecourse, even though they were clearly guilty and merited being made the most recent example of crime. People began to pity these sufferers. So Tacitus is not, he's hostile to Christians. He says they were guilty. They deserved it, right? But he says at night, Nero would basically make them torches in his gardens and ride around on chariots, right? Okay. And then he said, people began to pity these sufferers because they were consumed not for the public good, but on account of the fierceness of one man, okay? So Nero persecuted Christians, and that's why people would call Domitian Nero reborn or Nero resurrected. And I'll get you some quotes as we go further in this lesson about church historian Eusebius, who said Nero was the first to do it and Domitian was the second. Okay, so let's go to verse 17:7 now. But the angel said to me, why did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. Verse 8. The beast that you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not, yet is. Okay, so if you can pull my PowerPoint back up there, I want to show you. We're going to go through this fairly slowly. So the beast, okay, we saw the beast was the emperor, okay? So here in verse 8, it says, the beast that you saw, okay, in chapter 13. What do you think it means? He was and is not and will ascend out of the bottomless pit, okay? So it basically says, hey, this beast, whoever this emperor is that's persecuting Christians, was alive at one point, and now he's not alive. But later he's going to what? He's going to rise again, right? You see how people connect it to the Nero resurrected to rise again, okay? That's where a lot of people get this, specifically 17. In 13, there's like one verse, and sometimes you read that and say, all right, maybe that's a little much to get out of one verse, but chapter 17, I think, makes a better case for it, okay? So in the notes, I have a lot more of the stuff we talked about in 13, about this Nero revived myth, and this is from one, I think it's a Bible encyclopedia. According to this myth, popular in the first century Rome, Emperor Nero faked his suicide, escaped from Rome, and would return with a foreign army to humble his opponents and reestablish his throne. The myth persisted in Rome, and for some, Nero's anticipated return inspired hope for a new period of peace and prosperity for Rome, similar to the time of Caesar Augustus. That was the first Caesar. We'll look at that in a minute. For others, the prospect of Nero's return was terrifying. This was particularly true for early Christians, since Nero was well known for his brutal persecution of Christians and had used them as scapegoats for the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64. The Jews also dreaded and hated Nero, since he warred against the Jews in Palestine, captured Jerusalem, and destroyed the temple in AD 70. This myth is often referred to as the myth of Nero Redivivius, which is Nero reborn, or Nero resurrected, okay? So we're going to get a little bit more information in verse 10 about this, so just hold on for one more verse. Look at Revelation 17:9. Here is the mind which has wisdom. What's that? What do you think when you hear that? Yeah, like pay attention, right? It reminds me of Matthew 24, where Jesus, I forget the exact wording in verse maybe 15, where he basically says, let me just look it up. If someone could beat me there, Matthew 24:15. Let's see. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, and then the writer says, whoever reads, let him understand. It's almost kind of like, hey, now pay attention here, okay? Pay attention here. So verse 9 of chapter 17 of Revelation. Here is the mind which has wisdom. Okay, 7 heads are the 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Now, you already know from verse 18 that the woman is the great city that rules the world. So who is it? Okay, now, ironically, which makes perfect sense, Rome is called the city of seven hills, right? I think I may even have if you can go back to my PowerPoint, I may even have a map of the city of Rome. Okay, so this is basically the 7 hills, okay? So this is the Tiber River here, and you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The reason it's called the city on 7 hills is during the founding of Rome, these were all like little sort of areas that as Rome grew, they sort of grew into one giant city, okay? So Rome was called the city on 7 hills, okay? So verse 9, the 7 heads are the mountains on which the woman sits, okay? Now look at verse 10, if you can stay on that PowerPoint for me. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 10. There are also, how many kings? 7 kings, okay? This is where I get the date for the book, not just me, but this is where I get the date of its writing, for me personally, and also exactly like who is it, what the time it's being written, who is the beast, because I think basically John lays it out for you. I think he waits 17 chapters because you're not going to be into this far in the book unless you're actually diligently studying it, okay? So, there are 7 kings, 5 have fallen. What do you think that means? 5 have died, okay? 1 is, what do you think that means? 1 is right now, 1 is ruling now, okay, 1's alive. The other has not yet come. When he comes, he'll continue a short time, okay? So, in verse 10, this is what I think this is referencing, okay? If you go back and look at who the first emperor was, it was Augustus. It was not Julius Caesar. If you want to talk about that later, we can, but you can go read that Augustus, Octavian, is the one who was, I think, Julius Caesar's nephew maybe. We talked a lot about him. We called him Octavian, though, because that was his name before he took Caesar. We talked about him in the Daniel class, what he did, the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra and Mark Antony, all that drama. So the first emperor, Augustus, 27 BC to 14 AD, He's the first one that's actually referenced in Luke chapter 2 and verse 1. Okay? Then you have Tiberius. The stories of this is really pretty interesting. Augustus reigned. I think Tiberius was like an adopted son that was really not somebody they wanted to be emperor. And then Caligula, most of these Roman emperors, whenever they had other people that sort of had legit claims to the throne, what do you think they did to him? Yeah, they kill him, right? So Tiberius is coming to the end of his reign. He doesn't really have an heir, but there is this guy named Caligula, who I think was the nephew or grandson of a man named Germanicus, who was like a really popular general that had been killed because he sort of had a claim to the throne, or people were worried that he may try to take over Tiberius. Anyway, so Tiberius, you can actually see that Caligula, while he's known for doing a lot of wild things, you see how young he is? Tiberius was said to have Caligula come and stay with him when Tiberius was like maybe 70 years old. And Tiberius would torture people and have really disgusting, like sexually immoral things done to people in his presence, and he made Caligula watch. So you wonder why Caligula was so perverted at a young age. Well, Tiberius probably influenced him. So you have these three. So if the text says 5 have fallen, right? The first, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Okay, so 5 have fallen. Okay, so I think those are the first 5 emperors. Okay, so I think this is giving you the dating of the book. So 5 have fallen. These are the 5 that have died. 1 is. Okay, the current one by that math would be Vespasian. He ruled from 69 to 79. That's why I said earlier at the beginning, some people think the book is written before 70, talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. I don't think that fits the context personally. Some people think it's written really late, like 95. I don't think that if Domitian's the beast, that makes a whole lot of sense, because Domitian stops reigning at, let's see. Yeah, I think, those dates aren't right for Domitian. That's actually Titus's dates. So anyway, I think it makes sense that Vespasian is the time of writing. That's a minority position, but I'm fine with that. There's lots of things that I'm in the minority in the world that I don't have a problem with. So anyway, you got 5 who are fallen, the first 5 emperors. 1 is Vespasian. The other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must continue a short time. So the other has not yet come, I think hasn't come to power yet. Okay? So if Vespasian is the one currently reigning at the time of the writing of the book is written 69 to 79, anywhere in there, which makes sense if you're going to have a book that's going to be distributed to people and they're going to be preparing for this persecution under Domitian because they have some time to actually have it and prepare for it. Okay? The one that has not yet come, I think, is his son, Titus. When he comes, he must continue a short time. Titus reigned for 2 years. I think the average length of reign for a first century emperor is 18 years. So compared to all the others, he reigned for a very short time. Okay? And then, Revelation 17:11. The beast that was and is not, and is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition. You follow all that? Okay. The beast who was. Chapter 13, what was the beast? He was depicted as who? Nero, right? But Nero's dead at the time of writing. So the beast that was, Nero, and is not, he's currently what? He's not reigning, and Nero's dead, okay? Is himself the 8th. The 8th emperor would be Domitian, okay? And is of the 7. What does that mean? Well, Domitian was the brother of the 7th would be Titus. So Domitian was brothers with the 7th, okay? And he, the 8th, is going to go to perdition, right? So I think Domitian is the 8th emperor. And so I think that's what he's referencing in chapter 17 and verse 11. And this is where I think, yeah, go ahead, Lynn. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what they would say, if somebody took that, they would say, well, I guess there's multiple different, there's lots, just like there's lots of positions with Rome being in the date, there's different positions with people thinking the book is written. They may think that Nero is the beast because Nero is the one who sent Vespasian. Vespasian was the general that started the assault on Jerusalem in like 66 and 67. And then when Nero dies, you have like this civil war where a guy named Galba, Otho, and Vitellius all sort of try to take the throne. And then Vespasian, that's actually what causes him to leave the siege of Jerusalem and go back to Rome. He takes his legions and goes back and leaves his son, Titus, who's actually the one that ends up going in and actually destroying Jerusalem, right? So Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speak. I guess I can't speak for somebody that holds that position and say everything. I'd have to talk with them about it. But I think the context, chapter 13 and 17, point to Rome for sure. The city that rules over the whole world, the city on 7 hills, okay? And chapter 13 is just too much of a comparison to Daniel 7, okay? So Domitian being a Nero reborn. Let me read this. Remember, these numbers are wrong. I think he ruled from 81 to like 96. I think that might be right. But yeah, so ignore that. That's the, when I was copying and pasting, I must not have changed the date for his rule. Okay, so the beast that was, like Nero, is not currently, he's not right now, Vespasian's reigning now, is himself the 8th. He's like Domitian. He's not literally the 8th, but he's like Domitian, okay? This is some information. Eusebius, who's an early church historian, wrote this. Domitian, having shown great cruelty towards many, and having unjustly put to death no small number of well-born and notable men at Rome, and having without cause exiled and confiscated the property of a great many other illustrious men, finally became the successor of Nero in his hatred and enmity towards God. He was in fact the second that stirred up a persecution against us. So he says Domitian was the second that persecuted Christians, the first being Nero, right? Although his father Vespasian had undertaken nothing prejudicial to us. So he says Vespasian, the father of Domitian, he didn't persecute Christians at all. And this is, I think sometimes it's easier maybe because I've been reading about Roman emperors and listening to videos, but this guy Domitian is the son of Vespasian. So this was his oldest son, and it's interesting, he ruled for 2 years. I think he died at the age of like 40, and most people, why did he die so young? Well, most people think that Domitian poisoned him because he wanted to take the throne, right? And so a lot of times you'll have, if you're the emperor and the king, and you have an eldest son, you know that who's supposed to inherit the throne? He is. So you prepare him. You send him to the legions. You put him in political positions so he can meet people and prepare him. Well, if you have a son that's just younger than him, what do you think? You don't normally prepare that son because you think, oh, well, Titus is going to become emperor. He's going to be emperor for a long time. Therefore, his brother Domitian is never going to have a chance. And so what you see with Titus and Domitian, the Roman historians say that they prepped Titus. They gave him all the preparation to become a mature individual, but they didn't do that with Domitian. And so Domitian was immature and had this sort of like, what do you call it, complex, where he's like, never thought he always had to justify himself and overcompensate. And so they think that's one of the reasons why he became so paranoid and killed all these people, is because he was just not a mature individual. And then you thrust somebody who's immature into being, Pontifex Maximus or whatever, where you're literally the ruler of the world and nobody can tell you what to do. And what happens? You make a lot of bad decisions, okay? Any questions about that? I know it's complicated, right? I think the more you look at it, the more it'll make sense. If you want to go back and read, I've got lots of things you can, as you're reading through the notes, you can say, okay, I can go watch a video here. Just get on YouTube and search like Emperor Tiberius, Emperor Caligula, and watch some of their 10-minute biographies, and I think it'll help you put some of this stuff together a little bit more too. Okay, look at Revelation 17:12. The 10 horns which you saw, that's good for the PowerPoint. You can just stay on the verses now, that's good. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as of yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. All right, so I think this is the nations surrounding Rome. 10 is what? Number in the book that represents completeness, right? Just like 7. 7 is complete power, okay? So here you have 10 horns, which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as of yet. They're not ruling anything really, they're not like emperors ruling, but they receive authority for 1 hour. 1 hour is what? Long time or short time? Short time, right? I think this is talking about, some people call them the client kings. But, if Rome is ruling, they have all these little kingdoms around them that do what? Do whatever Rome says, right? So they have some power, but it's only because as long as they're vassal states or client kings to Rome, okay? And so the reason I think this is in verse 16 as we move forward, once Rome starts to fall, these nations are going to turn on her. They're going to turn on Rome, which makes sense, right? If you have a nation that's the world power and they're commanding and they can destroy you, then you do what? You obey them, and then what happens if they start to fall and all of a sudden you could rebel? Well, then you're going to rebel. That's right, okay? Chapter 18, I think, will reference this a little bit too. So look at 17:13. These are of one mind, okay, these 10 nations, these 10 kings, complete. They will give their power and authority to the beast. They're going to support Rome, okay, whenever it's beneficial for them. Verse 14. These will make war with the Lamb. Who's the Lamb? Jesus, all right. They'll make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. All right. Earlier in the book, in chapter 11, God's people, the two witnesses, were attacked by the beast, and they won until those two witnesses resurrected. And throughout the book, you have this idea of even if people persecute God's people, what happens in the end? Right. So, I mean, do you think any nation on earth is going to be able to fight Jesus and actually put up a fight? Is there any, let's say this, do you think all the nations in the world, if they actually did, I think it's figurative, but if they literally did gather together to fight Jesus, do you think that would be much of a battle? Of course it wouldn't. Jesus spoke the universe into existence. You think 100 nations with nukes is going to scare him if it was a physical battle? It's not. It's a literal, or it's not a literal battle. It's a spiritual battle. But you have this idea here that these people are trying to make war, fight against Jesus and his people, okay? Verse 15. We saw this verse earlier. Then he said to me, the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues, okay? So it's just Rome ruling the world, okay? Verse 16. The 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will what? Hate the harlot. Now wait a minute. And if you go back up and look in verse 12, the 10 horns were 10 kings, and they did what in verse 13? They will give their power and authority to the beast. So they were supporting Rome, right? And then later it says that they what? Verse 16, the 10 horns that were earlier supporting Rome, now are going to hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh and burn her with fire. What do you think that means? Ultimately, I think it means these other nations that Rome aligned with and they served Rome, once Rome starts to fall and fail, they're wicked people. They're going to basically say, we're going to save ourselves, right? So they're not going to go down with Rome. If they see Rome falling, they're going to basically watch out for their own tails. And if you look in the notes, I have all kinds of Old Testament references. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zephaniah, Ezekiel. Different passages that this is pulling from the Old Testament. All right, verse 17. For God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind, and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. So they're going to serve the beast until it no longer serves them. Verse 18. The woman whom you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. And that would be at this time who? Rome. I mean, you can go from, what, AD 1 to AD 476, and who's ruling the world? Rome is, right? So there's no question about who that's referencing, right? So whenever you sort of zoom out and you don't look at the specific examples of chapter 17, you have, once again, it's a vision of this evil, sinful woman who corrupts the whole world, which is the nation of Rome, and she's riding on the back of this beast who represents the emperor that was, at one point was alive. He's not around now because Vespasian's reigning, but later he's going to come and he's going to be the Emperor Domitian that persecutes Christians just like Nero, okay? We'll go into start into chapter 18. Chapter 18 is just once again going to, it's going to just basically give you some more information about the fall of Babylon the Great, which is who? Rome, right, okay. So let's go ahead and see how far we can get through there. I've got a lot more notes in the introduction. I'll let you read those if you want to. Revelation 18:1. After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. He cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird, right? Isaiah 21 and chapter 13 use the exact same language. It's in the notes if you want to go back and read it. Revelation 18:3. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. Okay, Jeremiah 25:15, guess what? It says the exact same thing of Old Testament Babylon, right? So you have the nation of Rome. Rome is not literally committing fornication. I'm sure all fornication was all over the nation of Rome, but it's not saying literally these kings would come and fornicate with the emperor. It's saying because of this unfaithfulness, this spiritual adultery, if you want to call it, all these nations around the world are being corrupted through Rome. Rome did basically make people worship not only gods, like the gods they borrowed from Greek mythology and made them their own, but also the emperor. We talked about that in chapter 13, right? So basically it's saying Rome is super wicked and sinful, and they're doing what to the rest of the world? They're influencing them and corrupting them, right? And it's using Old Testament language to say the exact same thing. God said Babylon did this, and then God did what to Babylon? Destroyed them, right? Okay. Verse 14, or 4, Revelation 18:4. I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins and you receive of her plagues, all right? So he's saying to people that are in Rome that they should do what? Come out of her. Once again, Old Testament language. There's, 400 allusions in the Old Testament. I don't know, I may have more in my notes, right? But if you just look through the notes, you'll see these once again. I'm not going to read every single one of them, okay? Verse 5. For her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. So Rome's been so wicked, her sins have reached to heaven, and God's heard about them. Is this something you've seen before? Remember in the Old Testament, Genesis 18 and 19? Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 18, verse 20. The Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grave, I will go down now and see whether what they have done altogether is according to the outcry that has come up to me, and if not, I will know. Right? It's just the same thing that is said throughout the Old Testament. When someone is wicked behavior, it rises to God. He hears it. Of course, he's omniscient. He sees it and knows everything. And then he will go down figuratively and act. Okay? Revelation 18:6. Render to her, to Babylon, as she rendered to you, and repay her double according to her works. In the cup which she has mixed, mix double for her. Old Testament language, Isaiah 40, Jeremiah 51, Ezekiel 23, the same thing. The point is, whenever somebody persecutes God's people, what is God going to do ultimately? He's going to pay them back, right? And it might be worse than what they did to God's people. That's why it says, refill it double, okay? Revelation 18:7. In the measure that she glorified herself and lived luxuriously, in the same measure give her torment and sorrow, for she says in her heart, I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and I will not see sorrow. Therefore her plagues will come in one day. Literally? No, figuratively, not in one day. And if you want to know why, here pretty shortly it's going to say in 1 hour. Okay? Her plagues will come in one day, verse 8, death and mourning and famine. She will be burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God who judges her. Okay? Basically it's saying judgment is going to come quickly because how arrogant she is. Isaiah chapter 47 and verse 9 says this, she will not know the loss of children and widowhood. They shall come upon you in their fullness because of the multitude of your sorceries. So basically they said the same thing, and it says in Isaiah 47:9, in one moment, in one day, your judgment will come. Same thing. You have an arrogant nation that says, I'm not going to know the loss of child. I'll never be a widow, meaning my life's going to be good. My husband's going to be healthy. My children are going to be healthy. Nothing bad can happen to me. And they're wicked nations, and God says what's going to happen? Bad things are going to happen. You're going to be judged. Okay? 18:9. The kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance for fear of her torment, saying, alas, alas, the great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. So these other nations, the 10 nations, the full number of nations, who were partnering with Rome and benefiting from her, whenever they see her fall, what do? Yeah, I'm staying back because I don't want to get near her sorrow. And so they're weeping, but they're not weeping for Rome. They're weeping because what? What does that do to their life? Yeah. I mean, imagine, okay, so like Evelyn has little toys, and they almost all of them say like made in Taiwan, right? Okay, if something happened to Taiwan, and all of a sudden Evelyn can't get these, I wouldn't be that upset. This is probably a bad analogy, but what's a better analogy? What's a nation we get a lot of stuff from? Okay, China. Let's say that tomorrow China had all these natural disasters and a sinkhole just swallowed them up. Would that make the supply chain a little bit more difficult for America? Right? Now imagine it's Rome, who is the world leader in probably pretty much everything, and they are now destroyed. What's that do to your life? Makes it difficult, right? So that's why they're wailing. Revelation 18:11, and the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore, right? So they say, look, that we're weeping not because really we're that upset about Rome, we're upset about how it affects us, okay? This is another reason I think this book points to Rome being, some people that take this as being Jerusalem, I don't think that makes sense. I just think in the first century, Rome is by far the world power that provides all this stuff, all the merchants. All right. Now, in verses 12 and 13, we won't read through that for time. But basically, it talks about merchandise of gold, silver, all these other things, the merchandise that Rome provided the world. And these are some of the things that people are basically mourning over the loss of. We'll go ahead and pick up there next week because I want to talk about where it says bodies and souls of men, talking about the slave trade, which Rome had and Jerusalem didn't. So Jerusalem was themselves in submission to Rome. So we'll pick up there next week. Thanks for your attention. There's a new sign-up sheet on the back. If you have not signed up before, or you said you signed up but you're not getting my emails, sign up again and make your email really legible if you can. And I'll add you to the list. And we'll send out the notes and videos later. If you have any questions, come talk to me, and thanks for your attention.